you know, the big hair and synth pop. There's this really compelling story, the Marielitos.
Hmm.
And it's much more than just a blip in history books. It's kind of this tangled story about a huge wave of immigration.
Right.
And it raises this big question, one that still feels relevant. What happens when loads of immigrants arrive and right away some get labeled as, well, undesirable? What does that do?
That's exactly what we're digging into. This deep dive, it's all about the Mariel Boatlift, 1980. A huge moment.
Huge how? Like
Yeah.
numbers wise.
Yeah, roughly 135,000 Cubans arrived in the U.S. just between April and September. It wasn't the first wave of Cuban immigration, obviously,
No.
but it became, well, let's just say the most talked about, mostly because of the circumstances around it.
Right. And that's what we want to unpack, not just the stats. We're trying to get the whole picture. Like,
Yeah.
what made the Cuban government suddenly say, okay, you can leave for Mariel? Who actually were these people, the ones called Marielitos and, the big one?
Yeah,
What was their impact? Especially when it comes to the whole crime issue.
yeah.
We've looked at historical accounts, analyses, trying to really understand it.
And the event itself, the boat lift, is pretty wild. The Cuban government just opened the port of Mariel,
Yeah.
said about 125,000 Cubans could leave.
Wow. Just like that.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And it wasn't some organized U.S. operation. It was kind of a ragtag fleet of boats heading across the Florida Strait.
Oh.
A real scramble.
Okay, so a massive spontaneous exodus, but then comes the controversy.
Right. This is where it gets tricky. Because within that huge group, there was this segment, maybe 16,000, maybe 20,000 people,
Yeah.
who got tagged almost immediately by some as criminals or, quote, undesirables.
That specific label.
Exactly. And it stuck. You saw it in news reports back then, like there was a 1985 Sun Sentinel piece. That kind of labeling, it has real consequences.
Absolutely. Consequences we need to think about.
For sure. And it's so important to actually look inside that label. You had people like Miami City Commissioner Demetrio Perez pointing out something crucial.
What was that?
He argued, look, maybe some had criminal records in Cuba, but under U.S. law, maybe those were minor things.
Okay, like jaywalking minor or...
Well, maybe not that minor, but potentially things considered less serious here.
Yeah.
Or, and this is key, maybe some were labeled criminals simply for opposing the government there.
Political prisoners, essentially.
It's plausible for some, yeah. The number often thrown around for actual, like, hardened criminals by U.S. standards was much lower, around 2,700.
That's a huge difference from 20,000.
Massive difference. And you have to consider the different legal systems, the whole political context. It's not black and white.
Definitely not. So initially, the U.S. government, were they welcoming?
At the very start, yes. There seemed to be this open stance around May 5th, 1980, kind of a welcome refugees vibe.
But that didn't last long.
Not at all. It shifted really fast. By June 7th, President Carter was publicly accusing Castro
Accusing him of what?
of intentionally, deliberately sending criminals, the quote-unquote undesirables, to the U.S.
Wow. Why the quick turnaround, do you think? What changed?
Well, it's likely a mix of things. The sheer volume of people arriving so quickly definitely strained resources. That's undeniable.
Logistical nightmare, I bet.
Absolutely. And then you had those reports, whether totally accurate or not, about criminal backgrounds starting to circulate. That probably stoked political fears.
And the Cold War context.
Exactly. Tensions were high. Anything Castro did was viewed with, let's say, a lot of suspicion.
So Carter makes this accusation. How did Castro react?
Well, about a week later, he denied it, said it wasn't true. But then he did something really unusual.
Oh.
He actually agreed to take back about 3,000 of the Marielitos.
Take them back. That sounds rare.
Extremely rare. Governments don't usually agree to take back their own citizens like that after they've left, especially under those circumstances.
Why would he do that?
It suggests, maybe, that the Cuban government was a bit worried about how this was all looking internationally. Perhaps it was damage control.
A way to soften the narrative?
Could be. It definitely makes the Mariel boat lift stand out from other mass migrations. That repatriation part is unique.
And the story didn't end there, of course. U.S. policy towards the Marielitos kept changing, depending on who was in the White House, right?
Oh, yeah. Big shifts.
Yeah.
You had President Clinton later on easing travel restrictions between the U.S. and Cuba. That included Marielitos wanting to visit family back home.
Okay, so some opening up there.
But then, under President Bush, things tightened up again. Those restrictions came back.
Why the back and forth? Just changing politics?
Pretty much. It usually mirrored the general temperature of U.S.-Cuba relations. Looser rules might have been seen as, an attempt at engagement.
Like an olive branch?
Sort of. And tightening them often happened when tensions flared up again, or when the U.S. wanted to put more pressure on Havana.
And for the Marielitos themselves, this must have been disruptive.
Hugely. Imagine your ability to see family changing based on who's president. It directly impacted their lives, their connections.
Then we get more recently, Obama's administration tried to normalize relations more.
Yeah, big steps then. Unlimited family visits were allowed, and crucially, the U.S. Embassy reopened in Havana.
A major shift.
It was. But then that got reversed pretty significantly under the Trump administration. They brought in what people called historically heavy sanctions against Cuba.
And now, under Biden.
So far, not a lot of major changes in either direction on that front. It really shows how these immigrants' lives got tangled up in the bigger geopolitical games.
Definitely. Their personal stories became footnotes to foreign policy debates.
That's a good way to put it. The whole Marielito experience just underlines how much immigration policy can swing back and forth with international relations. Real people, real consequences.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Away from the big picture politics and immigration policy for a moment, the term Marielitos also got specifically linked to crime gangs that emerged.
Yes, that's another layer to this. These gangs were mostly made up of male Cuban immigrants who came over in that 1980 boat lift. And they developed some very distinct traits.
Like what? What made them stand out?
Well, what's really interesting is how a sort of unique subculture formed. A lot of the original guys had specific tattoos.
Tattoos, like gang signs.
Sometimes, but also things like patron saints, names, words, even some quite arcane symbols. And there was often a link to Afro-Cuban religious practices.
Really? How so?
For some members, this involved rituals, sometimes including self-inflicted scars. It was part of their identity within the group.
Intense.
Yeah. And it's interesting, sometimes you'd see younger Cuban Americans, maybe in poorer areas, kind of imitating some of these symbols or rituals later on. Not necessarily meaning they were in the gangs, but it shows how that culture spread a bit.
And these gangs, their activities, what were they involved in? Not just petty stuff, I gather.
No, definitely not. They were linked to a whole range of serious crimes. Major players in drug trafficking, for sure. Contract killing was another big one they became known for.
Hired guns, basically.
Essentially, yes. Plus, things like prostitution rings, corruption, extortion, robbery, burglary, car theft, money laundering. It was pretty extensive. Suggests quite organized operations.
How do they get so established so quickly?
Alliances. That was key. They often teamed up with existing criminal networks.
Like who?
Think American mafia families, Colombian cartels, Mexican cartels, even the older Cuban mafia figures already in the U.S.
So they networked.
Exactly. These connections were vital for setting up drug pipelines, getting resources, protection, and the Marielito groups often served as muscle, as enforcers for these larger organizations in return.
So where are they now? Are these gangs still a major force?
Maybe not as widespread or dominant as they were back in the 80s. Things have changed.
But not gone completely.
No, not entirely. Reports suggest they still have a presence, some activity in cities like Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and specifically the South Bronx in New York.
So a lasting legacy, even if diminished.
It points to that, yeah. It's more enduring than just a blip in the 80s crime stats.
It really highlights something important, doesn't it? The long-term effects.
It does. The rise and persistence, even limited, of these gangs really underlines the huge challenges in integrating large immigrant groups, especially when, parts of that group face stigma, negative labels, and economic hardship right from the start.
And it contrasts sharply with earlier Cuban immigration waves, which were often seen as quite successful integrations.
Exactly. It shows how much the context matters, how people arrive, how they're received. Those factors are critical.
Okay, so let's try and pull this together. The Mariel Boatlift. Clearly way more complicated than just refugees arrive.
Absolutely. Shaped by Cuban politics, a U.S. response that went from welcoming to accusatory really fast.
Right, and that immediate controversial labeling of thousands as undesirables or criminals.
And then flowing from that, you get the emergence of these Marielito crime gangs, their own culture, their alliances, and the fact that, while maybe less powerful now, they haven't totally vanished.
It really is a powerful case study. Shows the complexities of mass migration, doesn't it?
Totally. And the dangers of just slapping labels on entire groups, the long shadow, that kind of initial perception and the policies that come from it can cast. Makes you think about how immigration, politics, crime, social integration, it's all tangled together.
It really does. So maybe a final thought for you, listening, to chew on. How do societies strike that balance, between genuine security worries and the need to integrate large groups of newcomers, especially when there are accusations flying around, true or not, about criminals among them?
Yeah.
What are the lasting effects of the labels we use
Yeah.
and the policies we build on those labels? It's a question that comes straight out of the Mariel story, but boy, it still feels incredibly relevant today.